The Lever. Subscriber-supported journalism that holds power accountable.
From The Lever's reader-supported newsroom, this is Lever Time. I'm Arjun Singh. It has been a devastating week for thousands in the United States. Hurricane Helene, a Category 4 hurricane, landed in the southeastern United States, killing more than 200 people, separating families and destroying communities. One of the most hard-hit states is North Carolina. In Asheville, North Carolina, one resident said they previously thought an extreme weather event like Helene was unimaginable. That is, until it came to their small North Carolina town. But as climate change worsens, nowhere appears to be safe from the possible impact of extreme weather. Yet, some lawmakers still refuse to take the threat seriously. North Carolina was once a model for how a state could adapt to changing weather. But that changed when Republicans took control more than a decade ago. With total control of the state government, North Carolina's GOP dismantled the state's climate adaptation infrastructure to curry favor with wealthy real estate developers. And this week, we saw the consequences of that. But this week also raises another concern. What happens when extreme weather overlaps with corporate malfeasance? That's the story of the town of Conyers, Georgia, where a fire in a chemical plant has made the air intolerable for residents who've been forced to evacuate. Residents who are also in Helene's path of destruction. Today on Lever Time, we're going to look at how government inaction contributed to these twin crises. I'll sit down with Katya Schwenk, a reporter here at The Lever, and our news editor, Lucy Dean Stockton. First, Katya will explain how poor regulations led to Georgia's chemical fire. Then, we'll hear from Lucy about how North Carolina Republicans set the stage for the damage of Helene.
We published a story this week looking at a chemical fire that has, over the last few days, sent, the metro area of Atlanta into a toxic haze.
Tonight, a hazard in the air. Thick gray and orange smoke billows from a chemical facility in Conyers, Georgia, after a fire today forcing nearby residents to evacuate.
And, the woman I spoke with for this story, Christina Brown, she lives directly, about 4 miles away from the chemical plant.
And I did smell some chlorine. It seemed very faint. Mm-hmm. So, they're trying to say if it's faint, it's not going to affect you. We instantly came back in. I was only out there for maybe 30 seconds. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Instant headache. I have a autoimmune disease called MCAS, which is mast cell activation syndrome, and so I'm very sensitive to a lot of fumes. My mast cells in my body pretty much go crazy, so I started to break out into hives.
Oh my god.
I started to get some hives, and my chest eventually later in the day started to feel just tight. I didn't experience any coughing or wheezing, and I could still take deep breaths, but it just felt very tight.
Wasn't quite right.
Yeah.
Christina Brown and her family, her husband and her 2 dogs, and tens of thousands of their neighbors in this town, in this county, have been under shelter-in-place orders all week.
Currently, they're only doing a shelter-in-place from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., saying that it's safe to breathe during the day, but between the hours of 7 p.m. and 7 a.m., it's not safe to breathe. Right now, because I have no choice but to let my dogs outside to go potty at least. I'm only letting them go out for a minute at a time. I'm not going to have them sitting out there all day. My headache got worse, and my headache has persisted.
And, Christina told me she learned about this on Sunday on social media. She found out about it in the morning. The chemical fire had been burning at this plant in Conyers, Georgia, since early that morning. She quickly fled with her husband and their dogs, while hoping, that the toxic smoke would clear, but has since returned to the town so her husband can go back to work and isn't quite sure when it's all going to be over. There are still ongoing periodic shelter-in-place orders that have come down.
Wow. That sounds really tragic and frightening. What happened exactly at this facility that led to that?
Yeah, so this facility is owned by a company called Biolab. It's a spa and pool chemical processor. So we don't know the full extent of what has happened at this chemical plant. But what we know so far is that, for some reason on Sunday morning, sometime around 3 a.m., a fire was started at this facility. And that fire set off the sprinkler system inside the building. And the water from the sprinklers interacted with a large amount of some kind of a water reactive chemical, is what local officials have said, sending up this enormous violent chemical reaction, this huge plume of chemicals. And we know that one of the chemicals this facility processes in large amounts is called TCCA, and what it can interact with water and produce large amounts of chlorine gas, which can be very dangerous in high concentrations.
Oh my, wait. So this facility safety system kicked in and sprinkled a bunch of water in an area where there was knowably chemicals that could interact with water in such a dangerous manner?
Yes.
Am I getting that right?
No, you are getting that right. And they've sort of said that perhaps that sprinkler was erroneous in some statements by local officials, like it wasn't meant to have gone off. In, Biolab, the company's statement, they said that in trying to put out the fire, that was their first priority. And so then water entered, the building. It's not totally clear what happened. But yes, in a facility where there's known water reactive chemicals, a sprinkler system apparently set off this chemical reaction.
I'm sorry, that sounds wildly irresponsible just from my perspective, but what do we know about this company, Biolab, this company, who owns it? And, is this company had a history of other accidents like this? And what do we know about this place that allowed this to happen?
Yeah, so we know that this is not the first time that something like this has happened at a Biolab facility. In fact, as far back as 2004 at the same plant in Georgia, we've seen accidents that are really strikingly similar to the one that we saw this week. 20 years ago, there was a similar chemical reaction, also sent a giant plume of chlorine gas up into the sky, also caused residents to evacuate. There have been at least 2 more accidents since that time. There is a Biolab facility in Louisiana that, as a result of a hurricane in 2020, Hurricane Laura, rainwater entered the building. The same water reactive chemical also set off a huge chemical accident, caused people to evacuate. So this is really, I think, part of a pattern that dates back decades for this company.
Is there any oversight of Biolab? Has there been any repercussions? Is there any role that the government, whether state and local or federal, plays in preventing something like that?
Yeah, so after the chemical fire in 2020 in Louisiana, the one that was a result partly of the hurricane, a federal agency, like a federal agency that investigates specifically chemical disasters, went in and looked at how is this allowed to happen? What kind of oversight does there need to be that perhaps does not exist at this point? And what this agency found is that, Biolab and the chemicals that it uses at some of these facilities is exempt from a key EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, rule that is supposed to prevent chemical disasters. So there are all of these requirements that many chemical facilities that are processing large amounts of dangerous chemicals have to follow because, the potential for such a catastrophic disaster. And, because of a big loophole, Biolab and its facilities do not have to, they don't have to abide by those requirements. And so I think that oversight failure is something environmentalists are once again pointing to in the wake of what's happened in Georgia.
It's interesting that you're bringing up these kind of regulatory loopholes and failures, because this week we have been witnessing just the horrible fallout of Hurricane Helene, which also did hit Georgia, but really devastatingly, it hit North Carolina. And I should say we're joined here by our news editor, Lucy Dean Stockton, who, Lucy, you've spent this week looking at North Carolina and the fallout of Helene, but you also found out that there were regulatory and policy failures that contributed to how bad the damage in Helene was as well, right?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I mean, so Hurricane Helene obviously swept the whole Southeast, and I think a lot of attention in these hurricanes is on coastal areas, but we're finding that more and more hurricanes are going inland and proving extremely dangerous. I mean, right now, Helene, I think the death count is well over 200 throughout the whole Southeast, and it really swept through the Appalachian Mountains and the Smoky Mountains in a way that I think people weren't expecting, particularly like devastating those mountain towns. One county executive for the county of Asheville, a small city 300 miles from the coast, called the flooding biblical devastation. It's wiped out the city. And what we were looking at is that North Carolina has had this really this major arc, and I would say decline in the 2000s. And a decline largely because of conservative lawmakers trying to stop both climate mitigation and adaptation measures in the state. Climate mitigation measures are aimed at reducing the amount of fossil fuels burned and carbon emissions that are going into the atmosphere, and therefore reducing global warming and its effects. And climate adaptation measures are looking at the reality of our changing climate and changing our infrastructure and processes to adapt to climate change. So whether that's through systems changes, updating emergency response processes, and in a lot of cases, changing our infrastructure. Both, I think, really come into play. I mean, North Carolina in the 2000s was a bastion of Southern progressivism, and it was considered by many...
That was the new South Sheen.
Yes, and it was considered by many to be like a beacon of climate progress in the South. In the early 2000s, they had the first renewables portfolio in the Southeast, which created major incentives to build solar panels and wind farms. And I think up until recently, North Carolina had some of the most solar panel capacity in the country.
Oh, wow.
At one point, it was second only to California. And they also passed all kinds of legislation, like the Clean Smokestacks Act, that cleaned up the atmosphere there. It actually created air pollution standards that went beyond the Clean Air Act. And then in 2010, things really sort of took a turn. Republicans gained the majority in the state's legislature, and a few years later, Pat McCrory, a former executive for the state's major public utility, Duke Energy, was elected as governor. That year, Republicans also gained a supermajority, which gave them the ability to ram through legislation and in some cases override a governor's veto. And this is also where climate adaptation comes into play. So in 2011, a state lawmaker proposed a bill that would prohibit communities from using current sea level rise data to adapt to climate change. It was nationally ridiculed as the state that outlawed climate change by Stephen Colbert.
This is a brilliant solution. If your science gives you a result that you don't like, pass a law saying that the result is illegal. Problem solved. Now, in fact, I think we should start applying this method to even more things that we don't want to happen. For example, I don't want to die. But the actuaries at my insurance company are convinced that it will happen sometime in the next 50 years. However, if we consider only historical data, I've been alive my entire life. Therefore, I always will be.
It's also important to know, I mean, North Carolina has this huge coastal seashore, and the sea level has been rising and dragging homes into the ocean. In addition, it's been raising the water table, so flooding what was once agrarian land with salty ocean water. Obviously, nothing can grow there. But I think it's important to know that in 2011, when the Republicans proposed this bill that prohibited the communities in their states from properly planning and adapting to climate change, It was pushed by many of the state's real estate interests, and the legislation was proposed by a representative who was also a real estate agent, because that sort of sea level rise, the accurate sea level rise data, would have threatened the industry. And adapting to climate change has been like a continual sticking point in the legislature. More recently, in 2023, Republican lawmakers overrode a gubernatorial veto, and they passed legislation barring these things called home sheathing inspections outside of coastal areas. So these are building codes, basically, that make buildings strong enough so that they can withstand hurricane-force winds. The North Carolina Home Builders Association, a trade group, they fought really hard to stop this bill. And they argued that upgrading housing to withstand hurricane-force winds wasn't needed outside of coastal areas. But we've seen, of course, that outside in Asheville, where there was this biblical devastation, they faced hurricane-force winds. It's the same, that same group actually that year also backed Republican lawmakers passing a bill to open millions of acres of the state's wetlands for development, despite the state's own climate resiliency plan that mandated they needed to protect wetlands. And that's important because wetlands, about 1 foot deep, can absorb hundreds of thousands of gallons of water, which is enough to flood dozens of homes downstream. They're really important flood mitigation resources, and they were instead had developers just push through this legislation that allowed them to build more homes while also destroying the very things that would help communities protect themselves from climate change.
So that all sounds, especially if you're a resident, bad, but also I would imagine if you're a developer and someone who has a stake in owning and creating homes. But I have to say, everything that you're describing right now, it's hard to not feel like there's an intentionality behind it, that these trade groups, that Pat McCrory, who's a former energy executive, are the leaders in trying to dismantle these climate regulations. And dismantle, I want to really hammer that point in that it sounded like they were going on a trajectory. These guys came in and just reversed that. Is that off the mark for me to feel or think, Lucy? Like, that there's an intentionality to this? Like, did these lawmakers seem aware that what they were doing was essentially sabotaging climate protections?
You know, I think obviously things are always complex on the ground. There are hundreds of lawmakers in every state.
Right.
But Pat McCrory, who was an executive at Duke Energy for 29 years and continued to receive lobbying money and campaign donations from them while he was in office, also chose many times to protect the utility. He not only helped back plans that didn't accelerate but protected fossil fuel usage in the state, but he also carved out sweetheart deals that allowed Duke Energy to not remediate major fields that they had contaminated with their coal mining operations.
And that's his former employer, right?
That's his former employer. And other conservative lawmakers, they removed incentives for solar panel generation. They allowed Duke Energy to pay households less for creating their own solar panels, basically making it harder and more expensive for people to switch to renewable energy within their communities. Republican lawmakers also stripped funding from the state's environmental agency in what was one of the steepest cuts in the nation, at the same time that they were criticizing its inefficacy. So in many ways, I think we've seen that climate progress was sabotaged in North Carolina over the past decade.
Wow. And Katya, to go back to the chemical disaster you were reporting on in Georgia, did you discover if there is any comparable sort of industry interference that might have contributed to the lack of oversight of that company BioLab? Like, was there lobbying? Was there cozy relationships within the state legislature? Going back to just that, it feels like that accident in Georgia was the result of an oversight failure. And I do wonder if there was also an industry push to, get that oversight out of the way.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we often find is behind an oversight failure, you look a little closer and you see years, in some cases, of industry lobbying. And that was definitely the case here in Georgia. So, as I had mentioned briefly earlier, part of the reason this facility wasn't covered by, this really important EPA oversight was because this chemical was not covered under this law. And what we found is that the chemical industry, which is, quite a powerful industry, has trade groups that are spending tens of millions of dollars a year lobbying on Washington. The chemical industry has pushed to ensure that the EPA does not add new chemicals to this list of covered substances, therefore excluding facilities that are dealing with dangerous chemicals from this kind of EPA oversight. We've had, even though regulators, like I mentioned just a year ago, were saying, this chemical that's being used by biolabs should really be covered by this oversight. And so I think you can really look back and see a direct, line of causation to these years of lobbying by the industry.
I also want to, pause here for a second to talk about the real fallout, the human fallout of what this has been. Returning back to Christina Brown, who you had talked about earlier, the resident in Georgia near this facility. I know you've talked to a couple other people in that area too. What is it like for them to have to go back to their home that's now quite literally under a toxic cloud? I mean, what is it like psychologically? How does it change the rhythm of their life? What do they tell you about what's been happening to the place that they feel safe and call home?
Yeah, I think it's been really difficult. It's really been a devastating week. That was something that Christina really emphasized to me, was how difficult it was to feel forced to return to a home that is literally enveloped in a gas that we know is dangerous, but we don't fully understand yet what, the potential consequences of exposure from it might be. But she felt that she and her husband felt that they didn't have a choice but to return home. And that's something that I've heard from other residents too. And I think there's a real lack or a real sense of a break in trust, that they don't feel that they can trust the local officials that have, are telling them different conflicting things about what's going on. They don't feel like they can trust, the federal officials who have seemingly failed to oversee this facility. And so I think that was another sort of key theme in my conversations with people in Conyers, was a real sense of a break in trust and a failure from the people who are supposed to be protecting them.
Lucy, I'd love to hear from you, just like what you've been reporting on out in North Carolina this week. So I have a few friends who live in the Asheville area. I've seen what they've been posting on social media, flooded out roads, calls for people to be able to go places where they can get food. And that hits incredibly close to home, and I know that's a reality that thousands of people are experiencing all the time. But, from the big picture, from what you've been reporting on, thinking about that idea of a home and habitability, what is the scope of homes in areas that are at risk and, have kind of been lost because of the damage that we've seen?
Asheville, it's a small city, but it's 100,000 people tucked into the state's Smoky Mountains, and it was hit by truly historic floods. The river had never risen so high. It destroyed the city's water system, so it's left many people without water, but it's also left residents cut off from a lot of outside access due to mudslides and washed out roads. In Buncombe County, where Asheville is located, the death toll has reached 57 people as of yesterday. And I think it is just going to be really devastating. I mean, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, is already warning that they're running out of money, and hurricane season is certainly not over. It goes all through the fall, and it's getting more intense and worse. But I think also the human toll is quite devastating. I mean, in addition to the many people who have lost their lives, entire small towns outside of Asheville have been washed away. And one advocate that I spoke to Dan Crawford, who's with the state's League of Conservation Voters, he's from the area, and he got emotional in our call, said he's gotten teary-eyed multiple times because he is lucky that his family survived. He has seen his neighbors' homes just destroyed, and I can only imagine the emotional and psychological toll that would take, especially knowing that lawmakers in the state have sabotaged things that would have made those areas stronger and more resilient, but also would have helped stem the source of climate change, which will have untold impacts on everyone on this planet.
Yeah, I mean, what you've laid out about the timeline of particularly Republican dismantling of these climate protections is astonishing, especially in light of what we've seen this week. You know, I'd be curious to hear from you, especially as extreme weather seems to be occurring more and more, and especially it's happening in places that did not think that they would experience these extreme weather events. You know, I'd love to hear from both of you as this week played out. What were some of the takeaways of you know, putting out these two stories kind of simultaneously? And I'll start with you, Lucy, because you're our news editor, and so you've really been seeing both of these kind of play out at the same time and working on both of them. What was that like?
Well, first of all, it was great to work with Katya on her story. It is kind of a bombshell report. But I think in the broader arc, I mean, so much of our reporting is regulatory accountability. And I think what we see again and again in facing this huge, untenable problem like climate change, I think it can sometimes be hard to find where things stem from and where they end. And I think following climate mitigation and adaptation efforts to their source and what happens when they're introduced and they fail is a really interesting way to assign responsibility to the many, many power players who are letting powerful corporate interests have their way and forget about safety restrictions and just continue polluting as normal. I also think that what we've seen is like regulatory failure at a federal level in the case of Conyers, and regulatory failure at a state level, which made the disaster in North Carolina potentially even worse. And I think what we find in our reporting is that a lot of this regulatory failure is driven by corporate interest and corporate greed and the lawmakers who enable it.
What about you, Katya?
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely second all of that. And you know, I think it was particularly striking to cover, you know, this chemical disaster in Georgia while we had in the wake of the devastation of the hurricane. And I sort of learned as I spoke with environmentalists and advocates that, you know, these kinds of, you know, chemical accidents, they expect them to occur alongside climate disasters, extreme weather, and they expect them to be compounded by this kind of extreme weather, as we saw this week, where, you know, emergency responders in Georgia were responding to both this hurricane and the fallout and this massive chemical fire at the same time. And I really think it shows, it was just a striking image to watch these two events play out at the same time. But, you know, I was also inspired by the people I spoke with in Georgia, who I really think are fighting for resiliency and fighting now for greater protection and for accountability in the wake of all of this.
I feel also I had seen some reporting, and I think this is directly relevant, is there were people in Conyers who may have fled for the hurricane and then came back and were instructed to shelter in place because of the toxic cloud of gas, and may not have even gotten emergency alerts because communication infrastructure was down because of the hurricane. I mean, there are so many ways that I think infrastructure is failing and people are being shuffled around between disasters. So,
Yeah, it raises the specter of climate migration and how we mitigate from all of that. Well, Katya and Lucy, it was great to have you on Lever Time this week. Thank you both for your reporting and for sharing it with us today.
Thank you, Arjun.
Thank you, Arjun.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Lever Time. This episode was produced by me, Arjun Singh, with editing support from Joel Warner and Lucy Dean Stockton. Our theme music was composed by Nick Campbell. We'll be back next week with another episode of Lever Time.